You know, if you look at the story of the American Central Bank, the story of the Fed, First Bank of America, all the rest of it, it's all the Jacksonian stuff, all the Hamilton versus Jefferson stuff, Benjamin Franklin, when Kennedy was shot, you know, Executive Order 1111, which was about monetizing silver and whatnot. I've put a blog up recently about it, just referring back to it, because the polishing of the golden turd is with us. I made a meme the other day of turning Donald Trump's haircut into a golden turd. So it's difficult to tell the difference.
Oh my God. Poor Donald.
So, yeah, I mean, it's I think he's gone the way of Obama almost as quickly as Obama himself did, which is, is sort of.
But I think, when you say almost as quickly as Obama himself did, I think that's very generous on Obama, because I remember when they said, okay, someone who didn't really know that much about American politics, if you see what I mean, everything I from across the pond, and was just like, oh, that character. But when they decided to, I'm sure I've told you this before, when they decided to name the cabinet at the beginning, it was not only bad that he had the likes of Timothy Geithner in, and basically he had the Clinton team in, but to just go one step beyond that, he said, and as for defense secretary, we'll keep the same guy that Bush had. And I remember thinking,
I think that's true. And as I say, I mean, he was anointed at the Al Smith dinner again. And that very rarely fails. So Catherine Austin Fitz is saying, look, he's the banker's boy. He's been put in there to get the digital passports in place, to try and close the gate, as it were. And I think she's right about that. I don't think the gate can be closed. I mean, I just don't. It's just a recurring theme. A section of the oligarchy always thinks, right, this is it, one last push, and we're, total control. And that always fails. And to think that it's a sort of a monolithic thing, I think is kind of to miss the point about how any organization actually works. And I think it's harder to sort of, part of my reason for going back into business, as you know, is that I felt that, when you leave the shop in other people's hands and then find they've got the fingers in the till, and so you feel like you've got to go in and try and sort it out in some small way, just on the part that affects you. And I'm by no means the only person that feels that way. I don't pretend not to be an establishment type character. I might be a bit eccentric, even a black sheep, as it were. But ultimately, it should be obvious to anyone that there are a bunch of rotters with their fingers in the till at the moment. So regardless of how much of what's in that till is yours, it's offensive to basic human senses of fair play. And so going back millennia, that's people when they're abused eventually kind of push back, and so the fact that we've got this sort of Donald Trump painting himself as the heroic tough man at the center and all this sort of business, it's absurd, as it's always been. So your Belloc tour and Chesterton and all the rest of it, I mean, they had that all down, you know, and it's not really any different. So this is, you know, something I keep reminding myself, you know, it's there are a particular set of hurdles to negotiate at the moment, and it's a harder hurdle course than it was when I was a younger man. I absolutely grant that, but essentially, it's still, you know, it's not much different for me now to when it was then. It's, you know, whether it's slightly more daunting that I've run the course before, as it were, I don't know. I mean, it's but to not have a go would actually be a win for the propagandists and the narrative pushers and all of this online psychological grooming that goes on. And you know, it seems to me, well, it's actually quite easy to turn that off. So I've been looking back at Bruce Charlton and Addicted to Distraction, and you know, when COVID started, the first thing I thought about was AIDS. And I'm sure there are a whole bunch of people now talking about, well, what COVID was, and people are sort of, you know, arguing the toss about whether this new Trump website or anything is, you know, revealing anything new, which I don't think it is. But the whole AIDS thing, during that, David recommended me to read the book The River, and I did. I sort of went along, had a read of that, and then I looked at the guy that wrote it. Was talking about he eventually was going to present his views on AIDS at the Royal Society, and I mean, it's on my blog, so I read it the other day. But the point being that when I was looking into that, I found a Peter Duesenberg interview on Joe Rogan, right? And Duesenberg got drummed out of the brownies because he's the one that actually said, well, actually, AIDS is actually hepatitis. It's not a thing at all. And the idea of COVID being a replay of AIDS, well, you know, people my age remember the AIDS adverts when they came out. Do you remember those?
Mm.
Essentially, it's just retreaded old tires, you know, on the part of the less than imaginative duffers who, you know, I don't think we're facing an oligarchy nearly as devious or effective as the one that was around, say, in the late 19th century, that set of robber barons. And of course, the people now are trading on, you know, what the Rockefellers managed to get going at that point, what Cecil Rhodes and, you know, all the stuff in Tragedy and Hope. But they're not nearly as accomplished, these people. You know, to call van der Leyen or the woman at the, what's she called, at the World Bank now?
You mean the ECB?
I do, yeah.
Christine Lagarde.
Christine Lagarde. You know, these are not accomplished people. They just aren't. Andrew Bailey, you know, Andrew Bailey is a, you know, he's a bit of an idiot. But that's the point, you know. You know, discredit the institutions that, if run properly according to their constitutions or memonarts and all the rest of it, would actually function much better than they do. You know, I mean, and there's, you know, there's nothing new in that. So you go back to Edmund Burke and the rotten boroughs, and, you know, these present discontents and all of this sort of thing. And you know, it's all happened before. There's no there really isn't anything new in any of this, and I think that the jig is up. You know, there's no way that this level of, you know, buffoonery isn't going to be noticed. You know, I just think it has, and I felt, you know, I felt at the, you know, towards the end of COVID that, you know, it's a, it was such a huge mistake. It ain't going back in the bottle anytime soon. Do you see what I mean?
I do, but may I be ever so slightly provocative?
You go for it, mate.
And that is to say, and I'm sure that this actually is not going to be so inconsistent with what you're saying, but I remember during the time of Matt Hancock, when he would make appearances, and shall we say, credibility itself was just not his credibility, but the credibility of the idea of credibility was being challenged. It was being undermined. Because when he went and did what he didn't just ruin his own reputation. It was far worse than that. It's like, as you were saying, any trust in any institution took a bash when that guy opened his mouth, etc.
Yeah.
It was really, really bad. It was Mel Brooks type thing. And I remember you yourself, you said it's almost like comedy. And I think that may have been in my mind the other day when I picked up some sort of book on Dada artists and surrealists and stuff like that. So the provocation possibly comes here. If Dada and surrealism and things like that were around, or, you know, starting to appear 100 years ago ish, and things like that, then okay, that was a kind of satirical and political type thing, as well as, you know, absurdist in different directions. And that has seeped into what we see in everyday discourse on politics and stuff like that. You know, the trust may be undermined, but it's as if this absurd thing has certainly become the norm. It feels like it's got worse in my lifetime because, you know, since I started noticing it, I feel like it's got worse. Since I was 11 or 12, listening to Radio 4 in the morning, in between the other radio programs, and thinking, maybe there's a hole in what that person just said. I think it's got much worse. I remember starting to shout at the television at age 15, you know, that became normal 15, 16, going, like that. And then suddenly realizing, oh my God, I'm allowed to shout at the TV. It's not accepted, but I'm allowed to. And then it's sort of whoever shouts at the TV is often right.
I think, you know, I think that's part of the objective of the propagandists that are tasked with undermining and discrediting what I think are perfectly good institutions, right? And then they have to hold up, right, okay, we know you're fed up of that, here's something better, right? So what is that something better? Well, the something better is still going direct, it's still identity pass, you know, all of that, all of that stuff that they were trying to prime everybody for with COVID. And, you know, it didn't work. It was absurd. And you know, they fooled a lot of people initially. Well, we all know that. But that's hard to do. And so, I mean, I have noticed that, I mean, like we're talking on Skype, Skype is ceasing to be a thing, you know, early next month. BitChute ceased to be a thing. I've actually uploaded my BitChute channel to the Wayback Machine, so I'll be able to watch my own videos when I'm in the UK. I can watch it perfectly well in Sweden. It's fine in Sweden. The anti-censorship laws in Sweden are actually really quite good, apparently.
BitChute is basically being deleted.
Not deleted, but you cannot access it in the UK because of the online safety harms stuff and all the rest of it. They don't want to risk being fined. There's an article on Off Guardian about it too, and a few people have mentioned it. But yeah, I mean, my BitChute channel sort of I've put a lot of stuff on there that I haven't been able to put on my YouTube channel. And then
can I just mention something in relation to this? I just feel like I should say this. Just the online harms. There was a time, probably about 2 or 3 months ago, when I took my students into Parliament, and Jeremy Wright was the former media minister, former attorney general. He was in the opposition. This was a room in Parliament where they're debating the ins and outs of something. So, you know, some sort of, like, it wasn't even a committee. You know, Christopher Chope was adjudicating and everyone was just speaking, and, you know, the government speaking and stuff like that. And some people were saying that not everything was as it should be and it wasn't all taken account. But I get the impression that, I mean, what was funny was seeing someone who was a former media minister under May objecting to stuff in a bill that, let's face it, was written by the Tories, wasn't it? It must have been. It must be the same, roughly.
I mean, the Tories and Labour don't exist as separate entities. That doesn't happen. And the last Corbyn was the last. You know, how real Corbyn was or not. I mean, you'll have a better view on that, or a more valid view than mine, because you know, old matey, his economic guy, you know him, don't you? John
McDonnell and James Schneider as well. Yeah.
I noticed you recommend that video with Anne Pettifor on the other day. With was it Michael Hudson?
I
didn't watch it. I kind of clocked it and thought I'll have a look, root it out if I get some time another time. But yeah, yeah. I mean, so I mean, it is also absurd, and it's easier to give up than to keep going, and I think how one keeps going is actually an important choice, and the answer is to get offline. Now, I was going to mention this to you. Brendan O'Connell did a video. His YouTube video is going again, and he did a video about the Joe Rogan and Murray thing. We exchanged messages about that, didn't we? Douglas Murray,
yeah,
that other guy. Anyway, what Brendan O'Connell says is that all of these alternative media stars, like Rogan, like Tucker Carlson, he interviewed Conor McGregor and the next Prime Minister of, I mean, it's just absurd beyond it. And there's this big discussion now. They actually recorded at the Masonic Hall in Dublin or something. And there's a guy called Sheridan who used to talk at the AV, Alternative View Talks, sort of saying he didn't think that it was any particular sort of messaging. It was just a good set, a good backdrop, and it's made by American media people, and you know they did it. You know they hire those sorts of places in the US all the time to do these ad hoc interview type things. I don't know. But what Brendan O'Connell was basically saying, that these people are all proteges of a guy called Ari Emanuel, who is Rahm Emanuel's brother, who owns the UFC and the WEF. So that's the World Wrestling Federation and the fighting thing, that Dana White bloke. Dana White bigging up Donald Trump, Joe Rogan, a commentator on that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, O'Connell is right. Brendan O'Connell is right. And he's
Rogan and Trump Yeah, and some people say that Trump got much more famous because of the UFC, but you know,
well, Trump has been famous for a long time. You know, he's been really famous since the 1980s, and I don't diss him as a property developer in the slightest. When he ran for president first time, and looking at his net worth and all the rest, I did do a blog about that, and I did a bit of digging to, basically my point was, look, he's a property developer. He's done some really good property development stuff, but he's owned by Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank, as we know, is the sick man of Europe in terms of the big level. Their derivative position is unravelable, as it were. So,
and also, money laundering for Deripaska, Russians, money laundering for so many other people,
including, and then that Cohn bloke as well. Back in the day, was his lawyer.
I meant Deutsche Bank. Yeah, Roy Cohn, but I also meant Deutsche Bank doing the money laundering for the Russian mafia and for Epstein.
So, but anyway, O'Connell's video was about a week ago. It's very, very good, and it's on his YouTube channel. And it's interesting because his thing is warning about the Israelis owning a lot of tech stuff, and he's saying that Intel is basically now an Israeli company, and the fact that a lot of backdoors in a lot of security stuff of other states, not just the US, but others as well. And then also the tie-up really between Russia and the Russian Jewish mafia, right? So
no one talks about that. No one talks about that.
Well, of course they don't. This is O'Connell's point. He says Whitney Webb never talks about it. But what his thesis is, well, actually, they are all on the payroll, okay? And the center of that payroll on his is Rahm Emanuel. I mean, it could be a media.
When you say they're all on the payroll, they're all on the payroll. What does that mean? That's not what that means.
Well, it was when you made your video about social media is about comment, not investigative journalism, and you said, look, Novara Media does seem to be paid for by the people that view it. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. It may or may not. It may change. But it's the same point about Substack at the moment and the route that it's taking to, terminal enshittification. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Democracy Now! Program. And of course, Democracy Now! Is, you said in your videos, funded by George Soros, Open Society Foundation or whatever. Well,
I can't remember what I did. That was some rant that I did when I also talked about Joe, didn't I?
It was ever so good, yeah. I mean, it's a really good video of yours.
Yeah. But yeah. The thing about the Russian Jewish mafia thing is, I saw the Jewish Chronicle today, which is obviously a total joke now. But I saw it, and I think the date was the 17th, and on the front page, it was quite interesting because they said something which I think is true. They did it from the Israeli angle, and it was because I went to Istanbul a couple of weeks ago, which was interesting in different ways. But I just so happened to see. I'll send you the video. I haven't made it yet, but I happened to catch a Turkish Communist Party rally, and they as I was leaving, I was in between the rally and the cops. And I actually ended up kind of bumping into the cops because I was so busy filming, I didn't realize I bumped into the cops. And then I turned around and they said, "Could you stop filming us, please?" And I was like, yeah, like this. But just as I bumped into them, the back of the Communist Party that I was filming, just like the Italian ultras, they let off the red flares. I was like, I'm not looking at anything else. That's all I'm looking at. So then I started to make the video, but then I looked at, I don't normally, because Turkish students that I've had before that were really political, this is like 10 years ago, they said to me, "Oh my God, The Guardian, what an awful paper." They said anyone who analyzes anything in Turkey knows that The Guardian is the most pro-war paper ever. And so I decided to start looking at what the Guardian says about Turkey. And I think 2 weeks ago, I'll put this on a video, but I'll tell you, Turkey, the leader of the opposition in Turkey, was making a comment on the way in which the guy who was going to run from their party against Erdogan, as soon as he announced that he was going to run against Erdogan, on the same day, he was already the mayor of Istanbul.
They arrested him, didn't they?
Yeah, on the same day as he said, I'm going to run on corruption charges. So, like 4 weeks later or something, like a week and a half ago, the leader of that party, who wasn't going to be running, the leader of that party released a statement. It went something like this, and it was in relation to the sister party, the Labour Party in the UK. And they said, that's our sister party. Keir Starmer was the Prime Minister of the UK. And they said, when all this is over, we will forget. Yeah, we will not remember the loudness of the insults of our enemies. What we will remember is the silence of our friends.
Yeah.
Which is going, oh my God, that's like hardcore. And then roughly the same time, there was a story that I think not this weekend gone, but the one before or the one before that, there was a conference. There was obviously the normal Ukraine type conference somewhere, but there was another conference, and the Turkish leader didn't go to the big NATO conference. He had one at home, and there's a photo of him shaking the hand of whatever the name is of the guy in charge of Syria. And he issued a statement, and he said for the Israelis to have bombed all of the Syrian military infrastructure as soon as that new government came into Syria was a bad thing, a very bad thing, because if you're interested in the stability of Syria, you should allow people like me to partner with them in order to bring about stability. So Erdogan is obviously fucking bad news, but part of the Turkish opposition complaint about Starmer was, you're more interested in regional geopolitical issues than protecting democracy in Turkey. So I mean, the irony is, you could say you're more interested in Middle East stability, but I think what they really wanted to say was, you're more interested in promoting instability in the Middle East than protecting democracy.
Yeah, I think that has been the intention all along. I mean, like Nixon and Beschler's stuff, there will be blood, about the petrodollar military industrial complex sort of dynamic and all the rest of it. Which is the other point about Trump. I mean, back in December, I was saying he's polishing the shoes of big oil, because there's a famous picture of him shoe shining J.R. Ewing, which is hilarious. But yeah, I mean, it's retreaded old tires, and they're tires, that don't, they don't run, they don't suit the vehicle. So, it's all this idea that, things we think are bugs in the system aren't bugs at all, they're features. And so it's a question of sort of saying, right, okay, so if the bugs are actually features, well, let's have a little bit of a redesign here, shall we? Because
some people talk about audit the Fed, and then some people say end the Fed. I remember you referencing end the Fed as an idea that would have its time now. But if you then take the other thing that you've been talking about, which is just put an anti-Fed guy in charge of the Fed, then
nationalise the Fed. The Fed is private. There's no two ways about it. The Bank of England isn't private. There's no two ways about that either. But the way the Bank of England operates and who it reports to isn't the Treasury anymore. It's the Bank of International Settlements. But the Fed is private. But the Bank of International Settlements itself is a cartel of all the central banks, some of which are private, some of which are nationalized. But the nationalized ones, all of those nations, basically participate in the bond market. And in doing that, what they've done is they've outsourced the creation of money as debt. That's a voluntary thing. So Dr. Jerry Brady had a very interesting blog about that the other day. It's on Substack, where he sort of, it's one of the most in detail sort of expositions of that, which is worth reading. So when it comes down to the Fed or the Bank of England, and the point about the Fed is, and the point about Doge and what that's doing to various Americans, so this Catherine Austin Fitts point, is that there's supposed to be congressional oversight, right? Congressional oversight as well of the Fed, even though it's private. And what Trump is doing is getting rid of that congressional oversight in spades. But that's a process that's been going on for ages. You know, the American Constitution is honoured more in the breach than the observation. You know, that's how things have gone. But it's the same with our unwritten Constitution.
What does that mean? It's honoured more in the breach than the observation. Does that mean
basically, you know, it's there, but they just ignore it.
Okay, and so he's getting rid of congressional oversight. So who does the Fed report to then?
Well, Jerome Powell was asked whether if he was told to resign by Donald Trump, would he? He said, no, I wouldn't. That's recent. It's not some AI sort of made up thing. That's what he actually said. But it's the same thing with Andrew Bailey. That's what Liz Truss has been saying about the Bank of England. You know, and she is right about that, you know. So you know, Kwasi Kwarteng and his supposed kamikaze budget, that was the budget that was needed at the time, but it wasn't the budget that the bondholders and the Bank of International Settlements wanted. They want crisis. They want to then exploit and gather in the weaker hands.
Hold on, you said the Bank of England is not under public ownership. No, you said Fed is not under public ownership, it's under private ownership. And then you said the Bank of England is under public.
The Bank of England was privatised in 1948, and the cork sniffers kind of talk about the shares that the government doesn't own or whatever. But to all intents and purposes, the Bank of England is nationalised. But it doesn't report anymore to the Treasury. Gordon Brown, one of the first things he did was made it independent. Yeah. So that undid the importance of the nationalisation of the Bank of England in 1948, whenever it was. Up to that point, it was privately owned by the other private banks. You know, so people like Montague Norman said all sorts of things. Reginald McKenna, people have said things about the Bank of England before it was privatised, which remain true, but it's a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind. What, you know, the essential reason that they are anti-democratic forces within the world is that the interests they serve are private shareholders and not national interests.
So in the late 90s, it goes from having the Treasury link to be a BIS.
Well, the until the Bank of England went independent, the Treasury had control of interest rate policies, and up until Margaret Thatcher, unemployment rate was something that they were interested in, and not just inflation. But the whole point and the understanding of inflation, right, is that in a really strange sense, inflation isn't really a thing. It is if you have a fixed supply of income, and so people do feel the effects of price gouging, right? But it's a transitionary thing, which is exploited then by people with first use of fiat money, because they get to buy things cheaply and then sell them at higher prices, and that the thumb screws have tightened because real wages have stagnated since the 70s, right? But when you analyze such a dynamic, or you know, something, there are several variables there, it's ever so hard to analyze. what's going on, because it's a strange thing to say, you know, well, inflation doesn't really exist when there's been so much navel goes, well, you know, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon or whatever. You know, that's what the Austrians will tell you or whatever. Well, essentially, you know, we mentioned distributism earlier. That's about production and how much can be produced, and have people got enough of what it's possible to produce, right? And if you measure that, right, as opposed to measure the quantity of money or ration the amount of money, and it's the rationing of the amount of money or the splurging of the amount of money that causes these temporary problems, which are transitional. But it's the exploitation of those transitions that enable accelerated return of wealth and centralization of wealth back to the top, right? Now, that isn't a bug, it's a feature. And that's something which bad actors in the establishment are quite happy with, because basically for them it's shooting fish in a barrel. I did a blog earlier about shooting fish in a barrel, sort of bumper stickering that idea. But the thing to read is Jerry Brady's thing. He's some sort of professor or doctor of economics and all the rest of it, and obviously spent a lot of time writing what he wrote, and it's very good. I can't be bothered. You know, it's not my job to explain this shit to you. I'm a businessman. I want to run my own business. And I want an even playing field, which there isn't. But you know, you kind of, as long as you can work out the skew of the playing field and it stays skewed in that way for long enough, you can make some money. You know, so I should worry. Of course I do, because it offends my sense of fair play as well, not just as it affects me, but as it affects everybody else.
Can I ask you? What may be viewed as a fairly vulgar question, may be viewed by you as a vulgar question as well, given the context. The stock market volatility. I'm guessing that I'm not saying that anyone's got any answers about the different things that are happening at the moment, in particularly people at the top who seem to be changing their mind quite a lot. But I'm just kind of thinking that at the beginning of April, when some of the tariff stuff started happening, that led to a fairly high level of volatility. I'm just wondering, do you think that that's probably going to be the highest amount of volatility for a while? Because
I doubt it, but who knows? My question about the stock market is this: is when was the last time there was a very well publicized initial public offering? You know, stock markets are about funding new businesses with capital raised on the stock market. The secondary market then in those shares is what the stock market is, which is supposed to reflect the profitability of those going forward. Well, it isn't that anymore, and it's not doing IPOs anymore. So what's happening? What's the equivalent of a modern IPO? Well, it's the venture capital. Where do venture capital get their money from? From the shadow banking sector. We used to be the merchant banking sector, right?
Okay.
So effectively, the route of
to market,
getting all the wealth straight to the top, right? The central banks are trying to cut out the middlemen, right, in conjunction with the global international banks, and they're doing that to try to get rid of small banks or smaller banks. So that's Richard Werner's points about the Sparkassen in Germany, right? Okay, and he's right about that. It's his point about the small banks in America. And again, all that stuff that happened a couple of years ago after COVID with the when bond prices started going back up, smaller banks got into a lot of trouble. So that was that internet bank or whatever, you know, do you remember that? Silicon Valley Bank and the other one, you know, but a lot of smaller banks are really struggling and will continue to struggle. But the point is that that's a process of monopolization. Cartels become oligopolies fold into monopolies, and if they can't have a monopoly, they will, get as close to a cartel as they possibly can, with the cartel acting as a monopoly. And that, so that's where we're at. It's, we've been in the new age of robber barons for a long time, and Trump's cabinet is a cabinet of robber barons. It's as simple as that.
I mean, I do remember thinking that even in the first time around, I sort of had a look and started to think about it, and I realized, particularly at the end in October 2020, when he did his round of pardoning everyone, including Michael Milken and all these other people, I sort of realized, oh wow, he really has surrounded himself with buyout people, hasn't he? It's like, it's that kind of those
well, and Mitt Romney, when he was running, he was tipped quite heavily, but of course that, whatever his lot's called, are they called Blair and Co? His venture capital Bain company, that's it. Yeah, I mean, KKR, I mean, they're ubiquitous in everything as well, as ubiquitous as people like Rahm Emanuel. You look at quite how many fingers they have in the pie. So this isn't Republican and Democrat. That one or other of them, none of them represents the American workers. They both represent, robber barons.
Yeah. The thing that you just said was very interesting. The way you said the big banks are getting bigger, the small banks are going out of business. When you said, when was the last time there was an IPO? The only IPO that I've heard about happening at the moment that hasn't happened yet, but it's the Shine Chinese fashion company that is still open to going into the UK. And, some people are saying, how can you allow that to happen because it's Chinese?
The thing is, Ranjan, for years now, as long as I can remember, it's all about mergers and acquisitions and putting them together. And that's your BlackRocks and your Vanguards and all of this sort of thing. And it's, that it's certainly not any sort of market I recognise. There's nothing to keep those guys honest, and they've got to where they are by not being honest. Is the point?
So if you've got anything going on with your business, you're just going to get bought up or merged.
Depending what the minimum lot size is of these huge conglomerates, and the other thing is as well, Warren Buffett's always let off the hook on this stuff. But, he might be everybody's famous miser or favourite, whatever. But he's up to his eyes in all this stuff. Of course he is. However amusing his letters to shareholders are and all the rest of it, he is part of the problem. He says in his own biography, The Snowball, that compound interest rates should be illegal. It's it's the eighth wonder of the world and all the rest of it. But of course, as long as it's legal, I'll keep doing it. That's his attitude.
Roger, I think I'm going to have a pause.
All right, mate. Well, look, good talking to you. And I'm going to finish just putting the last couple of deck chairs on my Titanic. And then, obviously it's a work day tomorrow. It's a I've really enjoyed talking because I've had the last 2 weeks off, and that's the first time I've done that probably since I lived in Spain. Where I've chosen time off. Yeah, time off. Brilliant. So, at the beginning of your 2 weeks, you went to Turkey, Istanbul. Yeah. Oh, by the way, there, I don't think we haven't spoken, have we? We spoke about Istanbul briefly. Yeah. Yeah. No. Well, in that case, I already told you. Seeing the Hagia Sophia and the Islamic art. One realization I had yesterday as I was walking down the canal, I looked at some of the graffiti on the canal, and they had images of Sid the Sexist, Skeletor from He-Man, so Viz and stuff like that. But then they also had the letters, like in the writing. And whereas I may previously have realized that sometimes the graffiti lettering actually has the characteristics of life forms. They almost look like characters, if you see what I mean. Sometimes
they can like put the volume in so they look like people. Yesterday was the first time that I'd seen any graffiti since going to the Islamic Art Museum and realizing that some of the Islamic arts, particularly the sculptures which have letters in, you know, seem so lifelike. It's the first seeing graffiti that was lifelike since seeing the Arabic letters that were lifelike. And I'm just thinking, wow, you know, both lifelike. And then one other thing, I was having a conversation about phenomenology. And so I looked up one of my books on phenomenology, started having a conversation with ChatGPT about it. And it made me think that yesterday or the day before, there was an alert from the FT about a guy called Ian Osborne, who was Jeffrey Epstein's fixer, who tried to get Jess Staley the job in charge of Barclays in 2013 and failed. And then eventually it happened in 2015. So he's referred to as a kind of mercurial figure by Staley's own barrister. And I think he ended up being a funder of Snapchat or something. Anyway, I haven't read the article about it, but the case is clearly over. And the judgment will come in at some point. So it's just interesting the way they've released that article in a way where no one will read it, in a way where they've done it, but it won't really be in the paper. It will just be on the internet, that type of thing. And I thought I could use that as an excuse to just say a little bit about what I thought of the case, because I did go. It's an upper tax tribunal. One of the things that I found interesting was you've got the judge and you've got two lay people. Of the lay people, one of them, his name is Martin. It escapes me for a second, his name. Martin something. There is a Nigel Higgins, who's the chairman, and there's a Martin something, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, Martin, whatever his name is, he used to set the gold price for the Gold Council, the last person to do so in 2002, whilst he was working for Rothschilds.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is a bit of a coincidence because the chairman of Barclays was the first non-Rothschild to be the CEO of Rothschilds. So it's kind of like, hey, hold on, you should recuse yourself. You should not be a layperson on this trial. Because your former colleague is giving evidence.
Okay. They're above bias, Ranjan. Goodness sake.
I know I'm being childish.
No, I was joking.
No. I know you were as well. The other thing that was quite interesting, right? I know you're not a gossip person, Roger. I know you're not. So there were two lay people. One of them was this guy, Nigel, Martin, whoever, Martin Frankel. It turns out that because Frankel is a relatively common name, I'm saying relatively, all right? Relatively. In some circles, it turns out that his father, Martin Frankel's father, was confused with a wealthier Frankel. And someone said to him, you know, if you're that Frankel guy, why don't you help out with the Wiener Institute, which is Holocaust studies in Russell Square? And he said, well, it turns out I'm not that Frankel, but I will help you. And so it turns out that Martin Frankel's dad was actually really big in Labour Friends of Israel and the Wiener Institute, none of which I particularly have a problem with, given the time that he was doing it. But the other thing that was quite interesting was the other lay person, me and this guy. So there's a guy who got fucked by Deutsche Bank called Mark Antony, who I occasionally talk to. And he's actually brought legal. I'm sure I've told you about him before. He's personally sued, you know, the gold cartel, all these other people. And he always has restraining orders put against him by the judges. So he thinks the judges are all bent. We looked up the name of Sarah Farquharson, who's the other person, and it turned out it's just a coincidence, but it's just a funny little thing. But her son used to go out with Malia Obama.
Oh wow!
Obama's kid, you know. And then the other thing was Staley, right? So basically, I've been asking ChatGPT, like, I've talking about phenomenology and saying if phenomenology is about what is known and what can be known, and the process of the emergence of what can be known, then what do those theories and a little bit of McLuhan and De Boer, those theories of media as well. How do, in the real world, those theories about what is known, what can be known, how can that lens be brought onto the Staley story in terms of what can be known? And yeah, so I was just kind of looking at that kind of thing, and yeah, no, that's kind of about it. But it was sort of like, oh yeah, so then it starts giving the theories of what's going on, and it was really interesting to see ChatGPT say exactly the same as what I was thinking, and the questions that were being asked, because people were saying, "What the fuck is he doing this for, Staley?" And do you remember Steve Middleton? He would sometimes talk about buying precedent, where there's a hundred injustices that have happened, but only one of them gets to be the test case that goes through, and whatever that verdict is, then afterwards gets applied to everything else.
Yeah.
And so, like, trying to rig that, and it feels like with the Staley thing, there's
that's why banking law is just so skewed against the customer, because they've shopped very wisely.
Yeah, and then that's a precedent.
Yeah.
No more conversation allowed.
Yeah, it's justice that money can buy.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to do with the Staley thing, one of the things interesting is, so why is he taking a civil case in which he admits to having sex with Staley's? He's admitted to having sex with, they refer to it as Epstein's staff members, and then the Financial Conduct Authority barrister. So in the headline, it just says Staley admits to consensual sex with Epstein's staff. The FCA barrister said, Staley's barrister said, "You can't do that. You can't do this. You're ridiculing my client and everything." The FCA barrister says, "You brought the case. I'm trying to be sensitive about this."
Yeah.
He shows the piece of paper, not to the court, but just to the judge. And then afterwards, she said, "Well, it turns out that this person with whom you had consensual sex, that was at Epstein's brother's flat." And he said, "Yeah, but Epstein never knew about it. And I never knew any of this stuff." Then she said, "This woman managed to get compensation from the estate, from the Epstein estate." And then she said, "But your name was carved out." So that means that she's seen a list of customers or whoever, and his name's not on it. I then asked one of the Bloomberg journalists who I recognized from years ago.
Yeah.
It's nice to me. I said to him, "So what's the deal with the carve out and stuff like that? Like, what does that all mean? Because if she's a sex trafficking victim, does that mean that she is saying that was voluntary?" Because my understanding of sex trafficking and consent is there's just no consent. Consent just doesn't count at all.
Yeah.
Without consent, because you're a trafficking victim, that's not consent. And the Bloomberg journalist said to me, "Over there, you can see those are the JP Morgan lawyers, and there are no Barclays lawyers. Barclays have not brought any lawyers here. So JP Morgan lawyers are there in the midst of everything, and they're there ready to raise their arms if something gets said that they don't like." But apparently, because there was the British Virgin Islands case against JP Morgan and they paid out, and then there was the Epstein victims case and they paid out on both of those, then apparently, and this was something that I would never have thought of, and not from the paper, just because of what he told me, the carve out is not necessarily there because it was consensual. Maybe the carve out is there because she can have a separate prosecution against him. Do you see what I mean? Like, because
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Carved out, and I was like, "Oh wow."
Yeah, but outside of that case, it's still a really good question, isn't it? Where's all that stuff that the FBI grabbed when they raided
the island?
Well, not just the island, but his place in, is it Palm Beach or whatever it was?
Oh yeah,
in Florida, and then his branch in.
We don't know the names of any of the customers, do we?
No, so yeah, yeah, you'd think there'd be some quite useful stuff if they were serious about really sorting these arseholes out. Well, there you go.
Do you remember Elliot Spitzer?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a list of this stuff going as long as your arm. I mean, it goes back forever. It's a sewer. The leader, was it the speaker of the Senate or whichever it was? He that was that boys club thing. Do you know?
Do you mean Bohemian Grove?
No. There was a great big exposure of this guy who was up to all sorts of no good
In the 80s?
Yeah, but you know the idea that what Epstein was up to is anything new, right? Or is something that hasn't been exposed but covered up again in the past. You know, it's a constant. It's an absolute constant. So, but there we are.
Yeah. Well, I'm well, all the best for this week. I am basically around in the afternoons. And
cool. Yeah. Well,
chat
soon. Hopefully, we can meet up in person in the not too distant. I'll be back in the UK in before too much longer.
Okay.
Cheers, Ranjan. Take this up on yours if you want to. I don't. I'm not going to.
Okay, I will. Yeah.
All right, mate. Lovely. Cheers, Ranjan. Take care. Good talking to you. Take care. Bye.